It was past 1 in the morning when I decoded my daughter's secret distress signal and drove through the dark toward a house I had never trusted. Standing outside the front door of that luxury home, I heard a woman's voice cut through the night, sharp, cold, practiced. "Go harder. Just keep it off her face. She still needs to sign the papers in the morning." My blood turned to ice. I kicked the door open. My daughter was on the floor, bruised, her clothing torn. And what I did next? Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm deeply grateful you're here. Drop a comment with your city or country so I know where you're watching from. This narrative includes creative elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or locations is purely coincidental, but the message remains deeply valuable. I found the message at 11:53 at night, tucked beneath the corner of an old paper coaster on my desk. The kind of paper coaster my daughter Cassie and I used to collect from every diner we visited when she was small, back when she still thought her father hung the moon. I almost didn't see it. I had been sitting at my desk for the better part of an hour, doing what old men do when sleep won't come, shuffling papers, straightening things that didn't need straightening. Running my thumb along the edge of Lena's photograph, the way I had done every night for the past 6 years since she left us. The house was quiet. November quiet, the kind that settles into the walls like cold air under a door. I lifted the coaster to set it aside, and that's when I saw it. A strip of paper torn from the corner of a notepad. 7 characters written in blue ink, so faint it looked like it had been pressed, rather than drawn, like someone had barely breathed onto the page, terrified that even the scratch of a pen might be heard. 3 numbers, 2 letters, 1 exclamation point. My chest went tight before my brain even finished reading it. 31 years as a criminal investigator for the state of Illinois teaches you things that don't wash out when you retire. It teaches you how people behave when they are afraid, truly afraid, not movie afraid, but the real kind that makes your handwriting small and your breathing shallow. And it teaches you codes. I taught Cassie this particular one myself on a rainy Sunday afternoon when she was 9 years old, and we were playing detective in the living room while Lana made chicken soup in the kitchen. We called it our family cipher. 7 characters that could say anything we needed to say to each other in a language no one else on earth would understand. I decoded it in under 40 seconds, my finger tracing each character on the surface of the desk like I used to trace letters with Cassie when she was learning to read. The message said, "Trapped. Using my name. Get me out." 1 a.m. I sat completely still for 30 seconds. I know because I watched the second hand on the clock above the bookshelf complete half a rotation. 30 seconds was all I allowed myself. 30 seconds to feel the full weight of what my daughter had just told me. 30 seconds for my heart to crack down the middle, the way old wood cracks in winter, slow and deep and final. Then I stood up, put on my jacket, and picked up my car keys. I did not call Detective Roy Sutter first. I knew I should have. 31 years of training told me to make the call, wait for backup. Approach the situation with procedure. But there is a version of a man that exists before the training underneath it, older than it, and that version heard his daughter's voice in 7 small characters and stopped listening to everything else. I grabbed my phone and pressed record on the voice memo app before I backed out of the driveway. While Illinois is strictly a 2-party consent state, the law carries a vital exemption. Recording without consent is legally admissible if a person has reasonable suspicion that a forcible crime is actively being committed. I had testified on that exact statutory exception twice in my career. Tonight I was betting my daughter's safety on it. The drive from my house in Edgewater to the Croft property in Winnetka takes 40 minutes on a clear night with no traffic. I made it in 34. I don't remember most of it. I remember the yellow center line of the highway unreeling in front of my headlights, like thread off a spool. I remember the way my hands felt on the wheel steady because I made them steady, because shaking hands are no use to anyone. I remember thinking about Lena. I remember thinking that if she were still alive, she would have called Roy first. She was always the practical one. I pulled onto Sheridan Road and cut my headlights 2 blocks from the Croft property. Old habit. You don't announce yourself. The house was a 2-story colonial set, back from the street behind a row of oak trees that had probably been there since before the neighborhood had streetlights. Every window was dark except for one on the ground floor, where a thin line of light bled through a gap in the curtains. I stepped out of the car and closed the door without slamming it, then stood on the sidewalk for a moment, listening. That's when I heard it. A woman's voice, sharp and low, cutting through the November air, with the kind of precision that told me it was not the first time she had spoken those words. Harder. Go harder. Just keep it off her face, she still needs to sign the papers in the morning. The voice belonged to Vivian Croft. I recognized it. I had heard it at the wedding, smooth and warm as caramel, welcoming my daughter into the family. I had heard it on the phone 3 times in the past year, full of reasonable explanations for why Cassie was too busy to talk. I would never mistake it for anyone else's voice as long as I lived. Something happened to me in that moment that I have no clinical word for. It was not rage exactly. Rage is hot. What moved through me was cold, cold, and very, very clear, the way the air gets clear right before a storm breaks. Every thought that was not immediately useful fell away. What remained was simple. My daughter was on the other side of that door, and I was going to reach her. I crossed the lawn in 8 steps. I did not knock. The door was a solid core wood door with a brass handle, the kind that looks impressive and is meant to keep people out. I pushed through it with everything I had, 30 years of training, and a father's absolute certainty driving me forward. It gave, and what I saw when I stepped into that living room, what I saw under that cold overhead light, on that expensive hardwood floor, is something I will carry in my chest for the rest of my life, like a stone that never gets lighter, only something you learn to walk with. Cassie was on the hardwood floor near the foot of the coffee table, her back against the base of the sofa, her knees pulled to her chest. Her face was marked with the evidence of what had been done to her. The sleeve of her blouse was torn, her whole posture, one of someone who had been through something no person should endure. When the door came open and the cold air rushed in ahead of me, she flinched, a full-body flinch, the kind that comes from weeks of learning that sudden sounds mean pain. Then she saw my face. "Daddy." Her voice came out cracked and small, like something that had been pressed flat and was only now trying to expand again. She hadn't called me Daddy since she was 11 years old. Nathan Croft was standing 4 feet away from her near the fireplace. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, and for 1/2 second he looked at me with the specific confusion of someone who has never once considered that consequences might have a face and a zip code and a father's fury behind them. That 1/2 second was all I needed. "Do not move," I said. I said it the same way I had said it to 312 people over the course of my career. Quietly. Without decoration. Vivian Croft was standing near the doorway to the kitchen, still wearing her silk blouse from what must have been an earlier dinner, her silver hair perfectly in place. She stared at me with an expression I had not expected, not fear, not guilt, but outrage. Pure, uncut outrage, the kind that belongs to people who have spent their entire lives believing the rules were written for other people. "You broke into my home," she said. Her voice was steady. I will have you arrested before sunrise. Ma'am, I said, you just invited a criminal charge of aggravated battery and coercion into your living room. The man on the floor is staying on the floor. You are going to step back against that wall and put your hands where I can see them, and you are going to stay exactly there until the police arrive. That is not a request. She opened her mouth. I have been recording since I left my driveway, I said. Every word spoken in this room since I arrived is on that recording. I suggest you think carefully before you say anything else. Her mouth closed. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket with my free hand and dialed Roy Sutter. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he had been awake. Roy, I said. It's Dale. I'm at the Croft property on Sheridan in Winnetka. I have a young woman here who has been battered. I have the 2 individuals responsible detained in the room. I need units now, and I need an ambulance. A pause. Then Roy's voice flat and immediate, the way it gets when he shifts gears. 10 minutes. You good? I'm good, but move. I hung up and looked back at Cassie. She had gotten herself up from the floor, while I was on the phone, pulling herself up by the arm of the sofa with both hands, her jaw set in a way that reminded me so sharply of her mother that my chest constricted around something I couldn't name. She was standing, barely, and with one hand still gripping the sofa cushion, but standing. Cassie, my voice came out rougher than I intended. I've got you. You hear me? I've got you. She crossed the room toward me, and when she reached me, she pressed her forehead against my shoulder and grabbed the front of my jacket with both fists and held on. She didn't make a sound. She was shaking so hard I could feel it through the fabric. I kept my right hand on Nathan's wrist. I put my left arm around my daughter. I stood in the middle of Vivian Croft's living room, and I held my child together while she fell apart, and I let her because that was what she needed, and because sometimes the most important thing a father can do is simply not let go. Nathan tried once to shift his position. I tightened my grip by approximately 15%, and he stopped trying. Vivian said nothing further. She stood against the wall with her hands at her sides, and her chin elevated and her eyes moving between me and her son and my daughter, with the calculating patience of someone already working through her next move. That frightened me more than anything else in the room. Not the anger, the patience. It was 8 minutes before I heard the first siren on Sheridan Road. Roy Sutter came through the door I had left open, badge out, 2 uniformed officers behind him, an EMT team 30 seconds back. He was 54 years old, built like a man, who had played linebacker in high school, and never entirely stopped with a gray mustache, and the kind of eyes that take in a room in one sweep and miss nothing. He looked at Nathan on the floor. He looked at Vivian against the wall. He looked at Cassie against my chest. He looked at me. You recording, he said. Since the driveway, I said. He nodded once slowly, the way you nod when something confirms what you already suspected. Good man. He turned to his officers. Get them separated. Read them their rights. And somebody get the EMTs in here for the young lady. The EMT team moved toward Cassie. She resisted letting go of my jacket for a moment, her fingers tightening on the lapel. Cassie, I said quietly, let them look at you. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be right here. She looked up at me. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was 4 years old and had woken from a nightmare, checking that I was real, that I was solid, that the world had not in fact come apart the way it had seemed to in the dark. You came, she whispered. Cassie. I held her face in both my hands, careful of the bruising. I will always come. In the pocket of my jacket, the phone was still recording. And somewhere outside on Sheridan Road, a second police unit was pulling up to the curb, its lights washing the oak trees, blue and red in the November dark. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to tell you who I am. Not the version of me that kicked open a door at 1 in the morning, with 30 years of training and a father's desperation driving his boot. The version before that. The version Lena married. I grew up in Rockford, Illinois, the second of 3 sons, born to a man who drove a city bus for 32 years and a woman who kept the books for a dry cleaning business on Auburn Street. We were not poor, we were not wealthy, we were the kind of family that fixed things instead of replacing them, that took 1 vacation a year to a lake in Wisconsin, that said grace before dinner, not because anyone told us to, but because it was the rhythm of the house and the rhythm felt right. My father used to say that a man's word was the only currency that couldn't be inflated or devalued, and that if you spent it carelessly, no bank on earth could give it back to you. I took that seriously. Maybe too seriously. My high school girlfriend told me once that I was the most careful person she had ever met, and she did not mean it as a compliment. I joined the Illinois State Police at 22, transferred to the Criminal Investigation Division at 26, and spent the next 31 years doing work that most people find grim and that I found, if I am honest, clarifying. There is something about the pursuit of truth, real truth, documented and provable, and stripped of everything that isn't fact, that steadies a person. It steadied me anyway. I met Lena at a church potluck in the fall of 1987. She had brought a sweet potato casserole that was genuinely the best thing I had ever eaten, and I told her so with the directness that my high school girlfriend had found so off-putting, and that Lena apparently found refreshing. She was a 3rd-grade teacher with paint-stained fingers and a laugh that started somewhere deep in her chest and worked its way out slowly like it was in no hurry to leave. We were married 14 months later in the same church where we met in a ceremony that lasted 22 minutes because the pastor knew we were both people who said what they meant and didn't require a lot of decoration around it. Tommy came first in the summer of 1989. He was loud and restless from the first hour of his life, a boy who grew into a man who couldn't sit still for long, who found his peace eventually behind the wheel of a long-haul truck covering the miles between one end of the country and the other. He called every Sunday. That was the deal we had, and Tommy kept deals. Cassie came 4 years later in the winter of 1993 during the worst ice storm Rockford had seen in a decade. I drove Lena to the hospital at 30 miles an hour on roads that were mirrors, white-knuckling the steering wheel the whole way, and when the nurse put that baby in my arms and I looked down at that small, serious face, Cassie has always had a serious face, even as a newborn, like she was already considering the weight of things. Something in me rearranged itself permanently. She was quiet, where Tommy was loud. Deliberate, where he was impulsive. She would sit at the kitchen table, with a puzzle for an hour, without making a sound, turning each piece over in her small fingers, with a patience that seemed borrowed from someone much older. Lena said Cassie got that from me. I believed her, and it made me prouder than I probably should have admitted. We were happy. That is not a complicated thing to say, but I want to say it plainly, because it matters. We were genuinely, ordinarily happy. Not the kind of happy that photographs well and falls apart behind closed doors, but the durable kind built from small dailiness. Sunday breakfasts, backyard cookouts in July. Lena grading papers at the kitchen table while I read case files in the chair across from her. The two of us comfortable in the same silence, the way people get when they have logged enough years together that silence stops being empty and starts being full. Lena was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the February of 2017. She was gone by the following October. 8 months from diagnosis to the end, which her oncologist told us was actually longer than average for her stage, and which felt like 8 minutes. I retired from the department 6 months after the funeral. Not because I couldn't do the work, I could have done the work another 4 years, physically and mentally. But the house was very quiet, and I found I needed to be in it. I needed to tend to it the way Lena had tended to it, because maintaining the house felt like maintaining something of her, some continuity of care that she would have approved of. Tommy took the road. That was how he grieved. He put miles under him, burned through the sorrow at 70 miles an hour across the flat middle of the country. I understood that. Grief looks different on every person who carries it. Cassie grieved by working. She had a good job at a marketing firm in the city, a small apartment in Lincoln Square, a group of friends I had met twice and liked. She called me every few days. She came home for holidays and her mother's birthday, and the anniversary of Lena's death. And she always brought something, food or flowers, or once memorably, a hand-painted ceramic mug with my name on it that she had made at one of those paint-your-own pottery places, lopsided and beautiful, and unlike anything I would have bought for myself. She was doing fine. We both were in the careful way people do fine after loss. And then in the spring of 2022, Cassie called me on a Tuesday evening and said she had met someone. Her voice had a quality in it that I had not heard since before her mother got sick, light, almost surprised by itself, like she couldn't quite believe she was allowed to feel it. His name was Nathan Croft. I remember sitting in the kitchen chair, where I always sit by the window that looks out onto the backyard, and feeling something that I did not examine closely enough. Not quite unease. Something quieter than that. Something I told myself was just the ordinary caution of a father who had lost too much already and was afraid of wanting good things too much in case they didn't hold. I should have examined it more closely. Lena always said I trusted my instincts about everything except the things that mattered most to me personally. She was right about that, the way she was right about most things. She was not there to remind me. I met Nathan Croft for the first time on a Saturday evening in May of 2022. At a restaurant called Hendrix on the north side of Chicago, one of those places with exposed brick and Edison bulbs, and a menu that describes everything in 4 words when 2 would do. Cassie had chosen it. She had made the reservation 3 weeks in advance, which told me she was nervous, which told me this mattered to her more than she was letting on. Nathan stood up when I walked in. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the handshake, not the smile, the fact that he stood. Men of a certain age were taught to stand when someone's father enters the room, and Nathan did it without hesitation, which suggested either good upbringing or excellent preparation. I did not yet know which. I was 34 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of even features that photograph well and reveal very little. He worked in financial consulting. He told me primarily advising family-owned businesses on asset management and estate structuring. He asked me about my years with the state police with what seemed like genuine interest, leaning forward slightly, his hands folded on the table. He did not talk about himself unless I asked a direct question. He laughed at the right moments. He touched Cassie's hand twice during dinner, once when she mentioned her mother, and once when she laughed at something he said, and both times it looked natural rather than performed. I drove home that night and sat in the kitchen for a long while and could not find a single specific thing to object to. That bothered me more than I admitted to myself. Gloria called the next morning. My sister is 3 years younger than me and has worked as a registered nurse for 31 years, which has given her a clinical eye for human behavior that she deploys with zero apology and considerable accuracy. She had driven up from Champaign for the dinner and driven back the same night, and she called me at 7:45 in the morning, which meant she had been thinking about it since she left. "Dale, she said without preamble. "There is something wrong with that man." "Good morning to you too," I said. "I'm serious. Did you watch his eyes when Cassie talked about her job?" I wasn't listening to what she was saying. He was watching the room. The whole time she was talking, he was watching who was watching them. "He was probably just aware of his surroundings," I said. "Some people are. Some people are aware. This man was calculating." She paused. "And the mother?" Gloria had met Vivian Croft briefly in the parking lot after dinner, when Vivian had materialized with the specific timing of someone who had been waiting for the right moment. She was 61 years old, silver-haired, dressed in the kind of understated clothing that costs more than it looks like it costs. She had taken both of Gloria's hands in hers and said how wonderful it was to meet family, and Gloria had smiled back and said all the right things, and then gotten into her car and driven south on Lakeshore Drive, feeling, as she told me, like she had just been appraised. "She asked me what you did before you retired," Gloria said. "Within 4 minutes of meeting me. Not what I do, what you did." She was making conversation. "Dale." Gloria's voice went flat in the way it does when she has run out of patience for diplomacy. "I have worked in hospitals for 30 years. I know what it looks like when someone is gathering information under cover of small talk. That woman was not making conversation. She was conducting an interview. I told Gloria she was being protective and that Cassie was a grown woman who could make her own decisions. Gloria told me I was being willfully blind because I wanted Cassie to be happy, and I was afraid of being the thing that stood in the way of that. We agreed to disagree, which was the standard resolution for approximately 40% of our conversations. I set aside the unease. That is the honest way to say it. I did not dismiss it. I set it aside deliberately, the way you set aside a bill you can't pay yet, and tell yourself you'll deal with it next month. Because Gloria was right about one thing. I wanted Cassie to be happy. 6 years of watching my daughter grieve her mother. 6 years of hearing the effort it took to keep her voice light when she called on Sundays. 6 years of the particular ache of wanting to fix something for your child that you cannot fix, and now, here was this man who made her sound the way she used to sound before everything got heavy. I chose hope over instinct. It is the only decision in this entire story that I am not certain I would make differently even now. The engagement happened in September, 4 months after that dinner. Nathan proposed at the same restaurant where I had first met him, which Cassie told me over the phone with a laugh that had tears in it. The wedding was planned for the following June, and then moved to March, when Vivian suggested, with the gentle authority of a woman accustomed to her suggestions being implemented, that a spring wedding would be lovelier, and that she had a connection with a venue in Lake Forest that could accommodate the revised date. Cassie said she didn't mind. She said it with the tone of someone who had already learned that minding was not particularly useful. I noticed that. I filed it away in the same drawer where I had filed Gloria's phone call, and the way Nathan's eyes moved around the room at Hendricks. The drawer was getting crowded, and I kept not opening it. The venue was a white tent on the grounds of a Lake Forest estate that Vivian's connection had provided at what I suspected was significant expense, though no one discussed numbers in my presence. There were 140 guests, approximately 100 of whom I did not recognize. The flowers were white and expensive. The food was catered by a company whose name I later Googled and whose prices I did not repeat to anyone. It was a beautiful wedding. Cassie was radiant in a way that made my throat tighten when she walked toward me at the top of the aisle. And when I put her hand in Nathan's hand, I told myself the tightness was ordinary, father of the bride emotion, and not the thing I actually suspect it was, which was my body trying to tell me something my mind was not yet prepared to hear. Vivian caught my eye across the tent during the reception and smiled at me. It was a gracious smile, warm and welcoming, the smile of a woman who had just acquired exactly what she came for. 3 weeks later, Cassie stopped returning my calls. The first week I told myself she was busy. Newlyweds are busy. They are building a life, arranging furniture, learning the rhythms of sharing a space with another person. Cassie had always been the kind of person who went quiet when she was absorbed in something, who could spend an entire afternoon in the same room as you without making a sound because her attention was elsewhere and she assumed you understood. I told myself this was that. I told myself I understood. The second week I called 3 times. The first 2 calls went to voicemail. The third time she picked up. Her voice was fine. That was the word that kept coming to me afterward, turning over in my mind like a coin I couldn't stop fingering. Fine. Not happy, not tired, not distracted, fine. She answered my questions in complete sentences. Nathan was well, the apartment was coming together. She had been meaning to call, but things had been hectic. She asked about my knee, which I had been having trouble with since October. She said she loved me before she hung up. Everything she said was correct. None of it sounded like her. I mentioned this to Gloria the following Sunday, trying to keep my voice neutral. Gloria said, with the patience of someone who had been right before and was not going to make a production of it, "Dale, people sound like that when they are reading from a script." I told her she was being dramatic. She told me she hoped I was right. A few weeks after that, Cassie appeared on social media. I am not a man who spends time on social media. I have an account on one platform that Tommy set up for me 3 years ago so I could see photographs of his truck stops and the occasional sunset over the Nevada desert. But Cassie had an account, and one evening I found myself looking at it, and there she was. A photograph of her and Nathan at what appeared to be a rooftop restaurant, her hair down, a glass of white wine in her hand, her head tilted back in what the caption described as the best Saturday ever. She looked happy. The photograph was bright and warm, and she was smiling the way people smile when they are having a good time and someone points a camera at them. I studied that photograph for longer than I should have. Something about it sat wrong with me in a way I could not articulate. The smile was right. The setting was right. But Cassie had a particular way of holding herself when she was genuinely at ease. A slight forward lean shoulders, dropped weight, distributed like someone who wasn't monitoring herself. In every photograph I had ever taken of my daughter, when she was actually happy, she looked like she had forgotten she was being photographed. In this photograph, she had not forgotten. I told myself I was overanalyzing. I told myself I was a retired investigator who had spent 31 years looking for things that were wrong, and that this had perhaps calibrated my suspicion meter in ways that were not useful in ordinary family life. I closed the application and went to bed. Vivian called me twice that fall, once in October and once in November. Both calls were warm, chatty, full of small news about Nathan's work and the apartment, and a weekend trip they had all taken to Michigan. She mentioned that Cassie had been dealing with a bout of fatigue. Nothing serious, just the adjustment of married life, and that they were all being careful not to overwhelm her with social obligations while she found her footing. She said this with such maternal solicitude that I found myself thanking her for looking out for my daughter, before I had time to notice that what she had actually done was explain in advance why Cassie would not be available. Both times she invited me for dinner and named a date. Both times, 3 days before that date, she called back to say something had come up, and could they reschedule? Something always came up. It was November when I ran into Brianna Walsh at the grocery store on Peterson Avenue. Brianna had been one of Cassie's closest friends since college, The kind of friend who shows up with food when something goes wrong and remembers birthdays without prompting. She was standing in the cereal aisle with a basket over her arm, and when she saw me, her face did something complicated. "Mr. Harmon," she said, "how are you? How is Cassie?" She's good," I said. "Busy. You know how newlyweds are." Brianna looked at me for a moment. Then she said carefully, the way you say something when you are not sure how much you are allowed to say. "I haven't been able to reach her in about 4 months. I texted and called, and I got one message back that said she was taking some time away from social stuff and not to worry. But it didn't." She stopped. "It didn't really sound like her." I stood in the cereal aisle of a grocery store in Rogers Park, with a basket of things I didn't need anymore in my hand, and something that I had been carefully not naming for the better part of a year moved through me like cold water. "When did you get that message?" I said. "August," she said. "Late August." I drove home and sat at the kitchen table where I always sit by the window that looks onto the backyard, and I opened my laptop and I looked at Cassie's social media account again. The photographs went back 6 months. There were 19 of them. Each one was bright and warm and carefully composed, and in each one, Cassie was smiling, and in not one single photograph did my daughter look like she had forgotten she was being photographed. I picked up my phone and I called Gloria. "You were right," I said when she answered. "She didn't say I told you so. She never does. She just said, 'Okay, Dale, what are we going to do about it?'" That night, I opened the notebook I used to keep case notes during my years with the department, the same brand I had used for 31 years, the same narrow-ruled pages. I uncapped a pen, and I wrote the date at the top of the first page. And then I started writing down everything I remembered in order from the beginning, the way I had always been taught. Because a man who spent 31 years finding the truth about other people's families was going to find the truth about his own. The letter from Ridgeline Property Management arrived on a Thursday morning in January, tucked between a utility bill and a coupon circular, the kind of envelope you almost throw away without opening, because nothing important ever comes in an envelope that plain. I almost did. I set it on the kitchen counter and made coffee first, and it was only when I sat down with my mug that I picked it up and slid my finger under the flap. It was a formal notice. Courteous, professional, 3 paragraphs long. It thanked me for submitting my intent to sell the property at my address, and confirmed that the management office had received my letter and would begin the process of notifying adjacent units per the terms of the Homeowners Association agreement. It referenced a letter I had allegedly sent on the 14th of December signed in my name requesting that the process begin at my earliest convenience. I read it twice. Then I put it down on the kitchen table and looked at it the way I used to look at evidence that contradicted the established timeline of a case, with the specific, careful stillness of someone who understands that the wrong reaction in this moment will cost them later. I had not written any letter. I had not signed anything. I had not spoken to anyone at Ridgeline Property Management in 4 years, and I had no intention of selling the house where Lena had hung the curtains in the front room, and where Tommy had put his first dent in the garage door at 15, and where Cassie had sat at the kitchen table doing homework for 12 consecutive years. I called Ridgeline and spoke to a woman named Carol, who was helpful and apologetic, and emailed me a scanned copy of the letter within the hour. I opened the scan on my laptop and enlarged the signature at the bottom. It was my name. The handwriting was close enough that someone who had seen my signature once or twice might not question it. But I had signed my name approximately 40,000 times in 31 years of law enforcement paperwork, and I knew the exact pressure I put on the D and the way the tail of the final N curves slightly left. This signature curved right. Someone had forged my handwriting. The question was not whether. The question was who and why and what they were trying to accomplish by making me believe I needed to sell my home. The answer to the first question took me 4 weeks and a conversation with Tommy to work out. The answer to the second question made me go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the February temperature outside. Tommy called on a Sunday, as he always did, from somewhere outside Amarillo, Texas, the sound of wind audible behind his voice. He listened to me describe the letter and the forged signature, and when I finished, there was a pause that stretched long enough that I could hear the highway noise shifting. That was when I remembered the insurance. 6 weeks earlier in December, I had received a letter from my health insurance carrier informing me that my policy was under administrative review following a complaint, alleging that I had submitted fraudulent claims for procedures I had not undergone. The review had frozen my account pending investigation. I had been annoyed and confused and had attributed it to some clerical error, had filed a written dispute, and had been waiting for a response that had not yet arrived. I told Tommy. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, Dale, someone is trying to cut you off. The house, the insurance, they're trying to make sure you're too busy putting out fires to pay attention to anything else. In Illinois, forging another person's signature on an official document is a Class 3 felony carrying a sentence of 2 to 5 years in state prison. Filing a false complaint with an insurance carrier to trigger a fraudulent investigation is a separate charge: insurance fraud, a Class 2 felony with penalties up to 7 years. Both offenses require the prosecution to establish intent, which means establishing that the person who did it knew exactly what they were doing and why. I did not yet have proof of who. But I was beginning to develop a very clear theory, and the theory had a name, and the name was Nathan Croft. How would he get my signature? I asked Tommy, thinking aloud, rather than asking a question I expected him to answer. Wedding paperwork, Tommy said immediately. Guest book, maybe. Or the venue contract. Didn't Vivian handle all of that? She would have needed someone to sign off on the seating chart approval. Something like that. I sat with that for a moment. The seating chart. A piece of paper I had signed without reading carefully at a venue walkthrough 14 months ago in a room full of white folding chairs and flower arrangements, while Vivian stood nearby with a clipboard and an expression of gracious efficiency. The health insurance situation was more sophisticated. My carrier later confirmed during the investigation that followed that someone had submitted a HIPAA authorization form, a document that, when signed by a patient, gives the carrier permission to release medical records to a specified third party. The form had been submitted with my forged signature, requesting my complete medical history be sent to an address that turned out to be a mailbox rental location on the north side. Whoever received those records had then used specific procedure codes from my history to construct a fraudulent complaint designed to look like I had been double billing for services. It was meticulous work. It was the work of someone who was not acting on impulse but executing a plan that had been thought through in advance, step by careful step. I called Gloria that evening and told her everything. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said in the voice she uses when she is genuinely frightened, but refusing to show it, "Dale, you need to be very careful. This isn't just someone being petty. This is someone who is trying to make sure you can't help Cassie, even if you figure out she needs help." "I know," I said. "Do you?" she said. "Because the Dale I know would already be in his car driving to that house." "I'm not going anywhere yet," I said. "Not until I know what I'm walking into." I uncapped my pen and opened the notebook to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote 2 words, Nathan Croft. Below that, I wrote forged signature, insurance complaint, HIPAA form, mailbox rental. Below that, I wrote, why Cassie? That was the question that kept me awake until 4 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom where Lena and I had slept for 27 years. Not the how, not even the who, the why. What was it about my daughter, quiet, deliberate, serious-faced Cassie, who turned puzzle pieces over in her small hands, that had made Nathan Croft and his mother decide she was the one they needed? I did not yet know the answer, but I was going to find it. Every year, on the third Saturday of November, I put white chrysanthemums on the kitchen table. Lena's favorite, not roses, never roses, she always said. Roses were for people who wanted to be impressive rather than sincere, and I make her sweet potato casserole from the recipe card she wrote out in her own handwriting and taped to the inside of the cabinet door, where it has lived for 32 years, and where I intend to leave it for the rest of my life. I make enough for 4 people, even when it is just me eating it, because the alternative is making the right amount for one, and I am not ready for that yet. This year, Nathan called on the Wednesday before to say they would come. I stood in the kitchen, holding the phone, and something loosened in my chest that I had not realized was clenched. Whatever suspicions I had been nursing for the better part of a year, whatever dark arithmetic I had been doing in that notebook on my desk, none of it mattered in that moment, as much as the fact that my daughter was going to be in this house on the day we remembered her mother. Gloria drove up from Champaign the morning of. She arrived before noon with a grocery bag and the expression of a woman who had made up her mind about something and was keeping it to herself until the right moment. She hugged me in the kitchen doorway, the way she always has, quick and fierce, both arms, no padding. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Better now," I said, and I meant it. Nathan's car pulled into the driveway at 2 in the afternoon. I watched from the kitchen window as they came up the front walk, Nathan's hand at the small of Cassie's back, steering, rather than guiding, the difference subtle enough that you would miss it if you weren't looking. I was looking. I had been looking at everything for 8 months. Cassie came through the door and hugged me, and I held on a moment longer than usual, and she let me. She smelled like her old shampoo, the kind she had used since college, and that small continuity made my throat tight. She looked thinner than I remembered. The shadows under her eyes had the particular quality of shadows that come not from one bad night, but from many. "You look tired, baby," I said quietly against her hair. "I'm fine, Daddy," she said. The same word, the same register. Fine. Nathan shook my hand firmly and asked about my knee with what sounded like genuine concern, and I said it was better and thanked him, and we looked at each other for 2 seconds longer than comfortable, and then both looked away. Gloria watched all of this from the kitchen doorway with her arms folded and said nothing. We ate in the dining room, the 4 of us at the table where this family had eaten 10,000 meals. I had set out Lena's good plates, the ones with the blue border that she had received as a wedding gift, and that we only used for occasions. Nathan complimented the casserole twice. He asked Gloria about her work at the hospital, with the attentiveness of a man who had learned that asking follow-up questions makes people feel heard. He was, as he had always been in my presence, perfectly calibrated. Cassie ate carefully. Not little, she ate a normal amount, but with the deliberateness of someone monitoring herself. She laughed at the right moments. She told a small story about a neighbor's dog that was charming and complete, and revealed nothing about her life inside that house in Winnetka. I watched Gloria watching Cassie. At one point, when Nathan got up to refill the water glasses, Gloria reached across the table and covered Cassie's hand with hers. Cassie's fingers tightened immediately, knuckles going pale, and she looked at her aunt with an expression that lasted less than 1 second before she smoothed it away into a smile. But Gloria had seen it, and Gloria's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from 50 years of being her brother. After dinner, Nathan stepped outside to take a phone call. I was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher. Gloria had gone to use the restroom. Cassie came and stood beside me at the sink, picking up a dish towel, and for a moment we worked in the ordinary, comfortable silence of a father and daughter who had done this together 10,000 times. Then she said very quietly, without looking up from the plate she was drying, "Daddy, do you remember our game? The detective game we used to play when I was little?" My hands went still in the soapy water. "I remember," I said. I kept my voice even. 31 years of training. "Do you still remember the code?" she said. "The one we made up that rainy Sunday." "Every character," I said. She nodded once, very slightly, still not looking at me. She set the dried plate carefully on the counter. Her hands were steady, but her breathing was not. I could see the slight irregularity of it in the rise and fall of her shoulders. "I always thought that was the best game we ever invented," she said. "I think about it sometimes." From outside, I heard Nathan's voice, a single short word, a change in tone that meant the call was ending. Cassie set down the dish towel and stepped back from the sink. "That was really good casserole, Daddy," she said at normal volume, the way you say something that is meant to be overheard. "You got Mom's recipe exactly right." Nathan came back through the kitchen door 30 seconds later. Cassie was at the refrigerator getting the butter dish. I was at the sink washing a pot, my hands under the water where no one could see that they were shaking. They left at 6. I stood on the front porch and watched Nathan's car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. And I stayed there until I could not see the taillights anymore, and then I stayed a little longer. Gloria came and stood beside me. "She's not fine," she said. "No," I said. "She's not." I went inside. I sat at my desk. The white chrysanthemums were still on the kitchen table, and the house smelled like sweet potato, and Lena's good dishes, and something else I could not name, the particular atmosphere of a conversation that had just happened in a language only 2 people in the world understood. I picked up the paper coaster on the corner of the desk to set it aside, and underneath it was a strip of torn notepad paper, 7 characters in faint blue ink pressed onto the page as lightly as a held breath. I sat at my desk for a long time before I touched it. The strip of paper lay on the blotter in front of me, 7 characters in blue ink, so faint they looked like they might dissolve if I breathed on them too hard. The house was quiet around me. The kitchen still smelled of sweet potato and Lena's good dishes. Outside, the November wind had picked up, pressing against the windows in irregular gusts, the kind of wind that finds every gap in an old house and reminds you it is there. I am not a man who is easily frightened. 31 years of criminal investigation will do that, will sand down the sharp edges of fear until what remains is something more manageable, something closer to alertness than panic. But I sat at that desk and I looked at those 7 characters, and my heart was beating in a way I had not felt since the night Lena's oncologist used the word terminal, and what I felt was not alertness. What I felt was a father's fear, which is different from every other kind. I picked up the strip of paper and held it under the desk lamp. The ink was pressed rather than drawn, the letters formed with the minimum pressure necessary to leave a mark, the handwriting of someone who was terrified of being heard. I had seen this kind of writing before in my years with the department. It is the writing of people in rooms where they are not alone and not safe. Cassie had written this in my house while Nathan was 30 feet away on the back porch taking a phone call. She had written it with a pen she must have brought with her, hidden somewhere on her person, carried into this house for exactly this purpose. The planning that implied the deliberateness of it told me that whatever was happening in that house in Winnetka was not something that had started recently. This had been building for a long time. She had been waiting for the right moment for a long time. I set the paper down and closed my eyes and went back. The code was born on the Sunday in March of 2002, when Cassie was 9 years old and the rain had been coming down since breakfast with no sign of stopping. Tommy was 16 and had his driver's license and had taken himself to a friend's house the moment the rain started, with the instinct of a teenager for escaping small spaces, which left Cassie and me in the living room with a checkers board. Neither of us particularly wanted to play, and the rain against the windows and the whole afternoon ahead of us. I had been reading a case file. I was always reading something in those years, always carrying the job home in one form or another. And Cassie had crawled up onto the arm of my chair and peered at the papers with the focused curiosity she brought to everything. "What's that?" she asked. "Coded messages," I said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough for a rainy Sunday. "How do you know what they say?" "You look for the pattern," I said. "Numbers stand for letters, or letters stand for numbers, or pictures stand for words. You just have to know the system." "Can we make one?" she said. "Our own system, that only we know." We spent the next 2 hours building it at the kitchen table, Cassie, with a yellow legal pad and a red pen, me suggesting, and her deciding, because it was her project, and I knew better than to take it over. She was methodical about it, testing each character, substitution checking for ambiguity, insisting that the system had to be memorable without being obvious. I remember thinking that she had a natural instinct for it, the same instinct that makes a good investigator, the ability to hold a complex system in your head and move through it cleanly. When we were done, she wrote out 2 copies of the key, one for her, one for me, and folded them into envelopes and sealed them with tape and wrote "Do not open" on the outside in red capitals. "These are for emergencies only," she said with the gravity of a 9-year-old who understood the weight of that word. "Agreed," I said. "Promise you'll remember it even without looking at the key," she said. "I promise," I said. I had never looked at the key again after that afternoon. I had never needed to. Some things you learn so thoroughly. They stop being knowledge and become something closer to instinct. The way you never forget how to ride a bicycle. The way my hands still knew after 31 years exactly how much pressure to use when applying a wrist lock. I opened my eyes and picked up the strip of paper and began. The first character was a number. In our system, a leading number indicated the decryption direction. Odd meant forward through the alphabet, even meant backward. The number was 7. Odd. Forward. I worked through each character in sequence, translating quietly in my head, moving through the system the way Cassie and I had built it on that rainy Sunday 21 years ago. It took me 4 minutes. Not because it was difficult, but because my hands were not entirely steady, and I was making myself go slowly and get it right. I read them twice. Then I set the paper down on the blotter very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. For 30 seconds, the same 30 seconds I had allowed myself on the night I would find myself driving to Winnetka. I was already in the habit, apparently, of giving myself 30 seconds. It was about how long it took for the emotional part of my brain to process something and hand control back to the part that knew what to do next. I picked up my phone. I thought about calling Roy Sutter. I looked at the clock, 11:47. I thought about what Roy would say, what the procedure would be, how long it would take, what I would need to establish before anyone in an official capacity could act. I thought about Cassie, 9 years old, sealing her envelope with tape and writing "Do not open" in red capitals. I put on my jacket. I picked up my keys. I pressed record on the voice memo application and put the phone in the inside left pocket of my jacket, close to my chest, where the microphone would pick up everything and where it would be difficult for anyone to take it from me without my knowing. Whatever happened in that house tonight would be documented clearly and completely in a format admissible in any court in the state. The night was cold, and the road was empty, and the yellow center line came at me in the headlights, like something being unspooled from a great distance. I did not call Roy until I was already on the highway. I knew I should have called him first. But there are moments when the training steps aside for something older and more fundamental, and this was one of them. My daughter had used our emergency code. She had planned it, hidden a pen, waited for her moment, and written 5 words in the lightest possible hand on a scrap of paper no larger than a bookmark. She had asked me 21 years ago to promise I would remember. I had promised. Before I reveal the shocking truth behind what they actually did to my daughter, drop the number 7 or comment, "Still here," so I know you're still with me. Also, please note, the following story contains fictional adjustments for dramatic storytelling. If you prefer not to listen further, feel free to turn off the video right now. In the weeks after that night, when the investigation was fully underway, and Roy had connected me with the federal team handling the financial crimes side of the case, I sat in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on West Monroe Street and listened to a woman named Carol Brandt explain to me in the careful, measured language of someone who has delivered devastating news before and knows that precision is a form of kindness, exactly what had been done to my daughter. Carol Brandt was the attorney brought in to represent Cassie's interests in the federal proceedings, mid-50s, gray-streaked hair pulled back without ceremony, the kind of woman who has spent 30 years in rooms where the stakes were high and has stopped being impressed by people who try to fill those rooms with noise rather than substance. She set a folder on the table in front of me and opened it and walked me through it page by page, and I sat across from her and listened and did not look away from a single page, because looking away felt like a betrayal of Cassie and of everything I should have seen sooner. It started in October of 2022, 3 weeks after the wedding. Vivian Croft had approached Cassie with what she described as a family financial planning opportunity, a chance, she said, to build something lasting for the next generation, to establish the kind of financial foundation that Vivian herself had always wished she'd had at Cassie's age. She was warm about it, maternal. She spoke about the future with the specificity of someone who had clearly thought about it deeply and cared about getting it right. She brought documents, a stack of them, each one tabbed and labeled in the organized manner of a woman accustomed to handling paperwork efficiently. She explained each one briefly in plain language without jargon. This one establishes the joint savings framework. This one designates you as an authorized signatory for administrative purposes. This one is standard liability language that the attorneys require for any multi-party financial structure. Cassie signed them. Of course she signed them. She was 29 years old and 3 weeks into her marriage, and her mother-in-law was sitting across from her at the kitchen table of her new home, warm and specific and reassuring. And there was no reason in the world at that point in her life to suspect that the woman she was being asked to trust was doing anything other than exactly what she said she was doing. What those documents actually established, as Carol Brandt walked me through them one by one, were 3 limited liability companies registered in Delaware, a state chosen specifically because Delaware's corporate registration laws require minimal disclosure of ownership information and allow for the designation of registered agents who serve as the public face of the company while the actual beneficial owners remain private. Cassie's name appeared on each filing as a managing member. Her Social Security number was associated with each entity's tax identification application. Her signature authorized each company to open operating accounts at 3 separate financial institutions. She had no idea. She had signed her name to the architecture of a money laundering operation and understood it to be a savings plan. Over the following 14 months, $7.4 million moved through those three companies. The money came in as consulting fees, licensing payments, and service retainers from a network of businesses that Carol's team had subsequently identified as either controlled by Vivian Croft's associates or operated by individuals with long-standing financial relationships with the Croft family. It moved through Cassie's companies in transit, arriving sitting briefly in the operating accounts, and then dispersing outward again in the form of payments to vendors, contractors, and professional service providers. Each transaction documented with invoices that described work that had never been performed. It was, Carol told me, a moderately sophisticated layering scheme. Not the most complex she had seen, but competently constructed and maintained consistently enough over 14 months that it would have been difficult to unravel without either an insider account or a forensic accountant with full access to the underlying transaction records. The paper trail led back to Cassie at every point. Her name, her social security number, her signature. If the scheme had continued undiscovered, or if something had gone wrong and federal investigators had been drawn to it through another channel, the person whose name was on every document was my daughter. That was the answer to the question I had lain awake asking for months. Why Cassie? Not because of anything she had done, not because of anything she was, because she was young and trusting, and had recently lost her mother, and was in the early months of a marriage to a man she loved, and had no professional training in financial structures, and no reason to read the fine print of documents presented to her by a woman she was trying to accept as family. Because she was in the cold calculation of people who treat other human beings as instruments ideal. I sat in that conference room, and I looked at my daughter's signature on page after page of documents she had not understood, and I felt something move through me that I do not have a clean word for. It was not anger, though anger was in it. It was not grief, though grief was in it too. It was something older and quieter than either of those things, the particular ache of a parent who understands fully, and without the comfort of ambiguity, the precise dimensions of the harm that came to their child while they were not watching. Carol closed the folder. "The good news," she said, and her voice was genuinely careful when she said it, "is that the evidence of coercion is clear. The sequence of document signings, the circumstances under which they occurred, the absence of any independent legal counsel, all of it supports a finding that Cassie acted under undue influence and without informed consent. She is a victim in this, Mr. Harmon. The law is going to see her that way." "And the bad news," I said. Carol looked at me steadily. "The bad news is that her name is on everything. Cleaning it up is going to take time. It is going to require her active participation in the federal investigation. And it is going to require her to relive in significant detail everything that was done to her." I nodded. I looked at the closed folder on the table between us. "She'll do it," I said. "She is the most deliberate person I have ever known. She planned for months to get me a message on a scrap of paper no bigger than a bookmark. She can do this." Carol held my gaze for a moment, and then she nodded, once the nod of someone who has assessed a situation and found it workable. Outside the window, 14 floors below, Chicago moved through its ordinary afternoon, indifferent and continuous. The way cities always are when your world has just been taken apart and laid out on a conference table for examination. The hospital assigned Cassie a room on the 4th floor, with a window that looked out onto a courtyard where someone had planted a small garden that had gone mostly dormant for winter, a few dried stalks still standing in the dark soil, patient and without self-pity. She was in that room for 4 days. I was there for most of it. Gloria came the first morning and took the chair by the window and stayed until visiting hours ended, knitting something pale blue and not talking much, which was exactly the right thing. Tommy drove straight through from outside of Indianapolis the moment I called him, arriving at 2 in the morning of the second day, with gas station coffee and red eyes, and a grip on my shoulder in the hallway that said everything he could not find words for. Cassie slept a great deal in those first 2 days. When she was awake, she was quiet in a way that felt different from her old quietness. Her old quietness had been the quietness of a person absorbed in thought, full and self-contained. This was the quietness of someone who had been running at maximum tension for a very long time and had finally been given permission to stop. On the third day, she was more herself. She sat up in the bed with the adjustable tray across her lap and ate the hospital oatmeal without complaining about it, which Lena would have said was a sign of genuine resilience. And she asked me about the investigation with the careful precision of someone who wanted to understand exactly where things stood. I told her what I knew. I did not soften it, and I did not expand on it, because she is her father's daughter, and she has never appreciated either of those things. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the courtyard garden through the window. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Always," I said. She looked down at her hands folded on the tray in front of her. Her left hand. The third finger of her left hand, where the ring should have been. "Mom's ring is gone," she said. Her voice was steady, the way voices get when a person has already done most of their crying about something, and what is left is just the fact of it stripped of its acute edge. Vivian took it, about 8 months ago. She said she needed cash for a property tax payment, and that the ring was just sitting there not doing anything, and that I could get it back once things settled down. I kept my face still. It is a skill keeping your face still. It takes practice and it takes a particular quality of care for the person you are listening to, the understanding that your reaction belongs to you, not to them, and that what they need in this moment is not your anger on their behalf, but your full attention. "She said that," I said. "She said it like it was reasonable," Cassie said. "That was the thing that got me. She wasn't apologetic about it. She just said it. Like the ring was inventory." She paused. "It was in the wooden box on my dresser. The one you gave me when I was 16 to keep jewelry in. She just opened it and took it out while I was in the other room." Lena had saved for that ring for 3 years. Not secretly, Lena did not do things secretly. It was not in her nature, but deliberately setting aside a small amount from each paycheck into an account she kept separate, because she had decided when Cassie was born that she wanted to give her daughter something real on the day she married something that had required sacrifice rather than convenience. The ring was white gold, with a small channel of diamonds around the band. Nothing extravagant, exactly the kind of thing Lena would choose, because it was beautiful without being showy, and because it would last. She had pressed it into Cassie's hands at the wedding, while I was talking to the pastor, the two of them standing in the side room of the venue, and whatever passed between them. In that moment, I was not there for and never asked about, because some things belong entirely to the people who shared them. I had not known until this moment that the ring was gone. The knowledge arrived in my chest like something physical, a weight settling in dense and specific. "I should have left sooner," Cassie said. She was still looking at her hands. "After the ring, I had known for a while, honestly, but after the ring, I couldn't." She stopped, started again. "There was a week after she took it where I just sat in the bedroom, and I thought about you, about what you would do. And I thought about our code, and I started thinking about how to get to a pen." "You hid it in your shoe," I said. She looked up at me quickly, surprised. "Shoe insert," I said. "Under the padding. That's where I would have hidden it." A small smile moved across her face, the first real smile I had seen from her in more than a year, unperformed and unscheduled, belonging only to this room and this moment. Under the padding, she confirmed. It took me 3 weeks to work out the logistics. Where to do it, how to make sure Nathan didn't see. She paused. I was scared, Daddy. I want you to know that. I was really scared the whole time. I know, I said, but I knew you'd come. She said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact you have never once doubted. I knew if I could just get the message to you, you'd come. I reached across the tray and covered her hands with mine. Her fingers were cold from the hospital air conditioning, and she turned them over and held on. I found it when I was clearing the table, I said. After you left, I almost didn't look under the coaster. I almost didn't put it there, she said. Nathan came back in from the porch earlier than I expected. I had about 45 seconds. 45 seconds, I said. I wrote fast, she said. I sat with that for a moment. My daughter in my kitchen with 45 seconds and a hidden pen and 21 years of trust in a code we had built on a rainy Sunday, writing her way back to me. Bah. I said the word came out before I thought about it, the same word Tommy had always used, that I had always left for him. I'm going to find that ring. She shook her head, and her grip on my hands tightened. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, Okay, but only if it comes back easily. Don't make it a whole thing. When have I ever made anything a whole thing? I said. She laughed. It came out surprised, like she hadn't planned on it. It filled the hospital room and bounced off the window and went out into the dormant courtyard garden, and I held on to the sound of it, the way you hold on to things you thought you might never hear again. There is a particular quality to reading an investigation file about your own family. It is different from reading any other kind of file, and I say that as a man who spent 31 years reading files about other people's families, their crimes, their cruelties, the specific inventive ways human beings find to cause harm to the people nearest them. Those files were terrible in the way that professional terrible is terrible, which is to say, you carry them home and set them down eventually, and they do not follow you into your sleep every night forever. This file followed me. Roy's team, working alongside the federal investigators on the financial crimes side, had reconstructed the full timeline of what Vivian Croft had done to my daughter's life in the months before that November night. I read through it at my kitchen table over 3 evenings, with coffee going cold, beside me and the notebook open to a fresh page, and I will tell you what they found, because you need to understand that what happened in that living room was not an act of panic or poor judgment. It was the final move in a campaign that had been running methodically and without interruption for more than a year. It started with the photographs. Sometime in the spring of 2023, the investigators placed it between April and May based on the metadata recovered from Vivian's laptop, which federal agents seized the night of the arrest. Vivian had gone through Cassie's phone. She had access to it because Nathan had collected it from Cassie the previous October, telling her that the distraction of social media was affecting her well-being and that a period of disconnection would do her good. The phone sat in a drawer in the home office. Vivian visited on Thursdays. She selected 18 photographs from Cassie's camera roll. All of them showed Cassie alone or with Nathan, none from before the wedding, none that included me or Gloria or Tommy or anyone from Cassie's life before Winnetka. She ran them through a photo editing application on her own device, adjusting the color temperature to make them look recent and brightening the contrast, so they read as the kind of casually joyful images that people post when they want to communicate that their life is going well. In several of them, the original image showed Cassie with shadows under her eyes or a tightness around her mouth that the editing smoothed away entirely. She created a new account on 2 social media platforms using Cassie's name and a new email address she had established for this purpose. She posted the photographs across a 4-month period, spacing them out, the way a real person spaces out posts, not every day, not with any obvious schedule, just often enough to create the impression of an active and contented life. She sent messages from that account to 7 people from Cassie's contact list. The messages were brief and consistent, that Cassie was taking a step back from social obligations, that she was focused on her marriage and her new life, that she was grateful for the friendships, but needed space right now, and hoped everyone would understand. The messages were written well enough. Vivian had clearly read through Cassie's old messages to calibrate the tone, but they carried the particular flatness of text written by someone who has studied a voice rather than lived in it. Brianna Walsh had received one of those messages. So had 4 other people who had tried in the months following to reach Cassie through other channels and found those channels equally closed. Under Illinois law, creating a false online profile, using another person's identity without their consent, constitutes criminal impersonation, a Class A misdemeanor that escalates to a Class 4 felony when used in conjunction with other criminal activity. Vivian's impersonation had been used to facilitate the ongoing concealment of the financial fraud scheme. The felony enhancement applied. But the piece of the file that stayed with me longest was not Vivian. It was Pastor Dennis Wade. Pastor Wade had presided over Nathan and Cassie's wedding. He was 63 years old, had led the same congregation in Lake Forest for 22 years, and had a reputation, according to the people Roy spoke to in the course of the investigation, for being a man of genuine rather than performative faith, the kind of pastor who shows up at the hospital rather than the kind who sends a card. 2 weeks before the wedding, Nathan Croft had requested a private meeting with him. Roy had the transcript of Pastor Wade's statement, which he had given voluntarily and with evident relief, like a man releasing something he had been holding at considerable cost to himself. In that meeting, Nathan had asked Pastor Wade to counsel Cassie on the virtue of wifely submission, specifically on the biblical basis for a wife deferring to her husband's judgment in matters of finances and social obligations. Pastor Wade had expressed discomfort with the framing. Nathan had then mentioned in the careful language of a man who understood exactly what he was doing that he had recently learned of certain irregularities in the church's property tax filings from several years ago, and that he imagined that kind of thing could become complicated if it came to the attention of the wrong people. Pastor Wade had not counseled Cassie on submission, but he had not warned her either. He had not called me. He had not spoken to anyone. He had absorbed the threat and carried it alone through the wedding ceremony and the 14 months that followed, and it had cost him visibly in the way that silence always costs people who are not built for it. He came to the hospital on Cassie's 2nd day. I was in the hallway getting coffee when I saw him come through the elevator doors, tall man gray at the temples, holding his hat in both hands, in the way people hold things when they don't know what to do with their hands. He saw me and stopped walking. "Mr. Harmon," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. "I owe your daughter an apology that I don't know how to make large enough." I looked at him for a moment. A man standing in a hospital hallway holding his hat, carrying 14 months of silence on his face like a physical weight. "Come sit down, Pastor," I said. "Tell me what you know. We'll figure out the rest from there." He nodded, and his shoulders dropped about 2 inches, and we went and sat in the chairs by the window at the end of the hall, and he told me everything. His hands shook the entire time. When he finished, I sat with it for a moment, and then I said the thing that I believed and that I meant completely. You were threatened by a man who had been practicing manipulation since before you ever met him. What matters now is that you're here." He pressed his lips together and looked out the window and nodded, and I could see him deciding to accept that, choosing to set down the part of the weight he was allowed to set down. Roy Sutter and I have known each other for 19 years. We met when he was a detective, second grade, working financial crimes for Cook County. And I was wrapping up my last 5 years with the state, and we ended up on opposite sides of a jurisdictional dispute over a fraud case that neither of us wanted to lose, and that we eventually resolved by going for beers and dividing the credit in a way that satisfied our respective supervisors without either of us having to lie. That is the foundation of most good professional relationships. In my experience, a shared willingness to solve the actual problem rather than argue about who gets to solve it. Roy is not a man who uses 10 words when 3 will do. He is also not a man who presents information in a flattering sequence. He gives you the hardest part first and lets you absorb it, and then he gives you the rest. I have always respected that about him. It is a quality I tried to develop in myself over 31 years and never quite achieved to his standard. He called me into his office on the morning of the second day after the arrest, a small room on the 3rd floor of the Winnetka PD building that smelled of old coffee and dry erase markers, with a whiteboard on one wall covered in a timeline that I recognized as the financial crimes reconstruction from the federal team. He set a notebook on the desk between us. Not a department-issued notebook. A personal one, the kind you buy at a drugstore, spiral-bound, with a floral cover that had been handled so many times the flowers were barely visible anymore. "Brenda Cole," he said. 58 years old, retired CPA. Lives at the property directly north of the Croft estate, has for 6 years. You want to know what kind of neighbor she is? "Tell me," I said. "The kind that notices things," Roy said. "The kind that writes them down." He opened the notebook to the first page and turned it so I could read it. The handwriting was small and precise. The handwriting of someone accustomed to working with numbers. Each entry dated, each entry timed to the quarter hour. Each entry describing in the neutral language of a person who had decided to observe without interpreting what she had seen from her property. The entries went back 4 years. 4 years of Thursday afternoons, when a silver Mercedes that Brenda had eventually traced to a shell company pulled into the Croft driveway and stayed between 2 and 4 hours. 4 years of occasional late-night arrivals by men Brenda described only by clothing and approximate age, never staying long, never announcing themselves. 2 years of what Brenda had noted as a pattern of young women. She counted 7 in total, over the full 4 years, who appeared at the Croft property for periods ranging from a few weeks to several months, and then were not seen again. "She tried to look them up," Roy said, tapping one of the later entries. "The women. After the third one disappeared, she started trying to find out who they were. Got plate numbers on 2 of the cars that dropped them off. Ran them herself. She still has access to some research databases from her accounting work. Both plates came back to the same registered agent company in Delaware, the same state where Cassie's 3 LLCs had been registered." I sat with that for a moment, feeling the shape of what Vivian Croft actually was: not the scope of one crime against one family, but the practiced operation of a woman who had been doing versions of this for years, refining the method, selecting her instruments with increasing precision. "Why didn't Brenda report it?" I said. Roy leaned back in his chair. "She tried. Twice. First time about 2 years ago, she called the non-emergency line and described the pattern. Officer took a report. Nothing happened. Second time, she went in person to the station and asked to speak to someone in financial crimes. She was told that without specific evidence of a specific crime, she didn't have enough for an investigation. He paused. She was also told informally by the officer she spoke to that the Croft family had significant standing in the community and that she should be careful about making accusations she couldn't support. I looked at him. "I know," he said. "I'm looking into that too." Brenda had kept writing anyway. Not because she believed anyone would listen, Roy said, but because she was a woman who had spent 30 years keeping meticulous records and did not know how to stop simply because the records were inconvenient for people with standing. The night of the arrest, she had heard the raised voice through her bedroom window. Her property was close enough to the Croft house that sound carried on a still November night, and she had called 911 immediately, and she had gone to her window and watched, and when she saw a man she did not recognize walk quickly toward a car parked half a block away, she had read the plate number into her phone and called Roy's direct line, a number she had obtained 2 years earlier from a cousin who worked dispatch. That plate number belonged to a vehicle registered to a company called Meridian Asset Holdings, LLC. Vincent Rallo's company. Roy closed the notebook and slid it back toward himself. "Her records go back 4 years," he said. "2 of the women she documented we have not yet been able to identify. We're working on it." He stopped. Then he said quietly, the way Roy says things that cost him something, "Dale, your daughter was not the first. And if that night had gone differently, she probably would not have been the last." I put both hands flat on the desk in front of me and looked at them for a moment. The hands of a man who had spent 31 years finding things out and had not found this out in time to prevent what happened to his child. I let myself feel that for exactly as long as it took to breathe in and breathe out, and then I looked up at Roy. "Where is Rollo now?" I said. Roy's expression shifted into something I recognized, the look of a man about to give you the one piece of good news in an otherwise difficult briefing. "Waiting room," he said. He asked to speak to the father. Vincent Rollo did not look like what I had expected. I am not sure what I had expected exactly. The word accomplice carries certain images with it, certain associations built up from 31 years of case files and courtroom appearances. What I got was a man of about 60, heavyset in a charcoal suit that had been expensive when it was new, and was now showing the particular fatigue of clothing that has been worn through a long and stressful day. I was sitting in one of the plastic chairs in the family consultation room. Roy had arranged for a room with a window, not a formal interrogation room, which told me Roy had already made some preliminary assessment of Rollo's value and adjusted his approach accordingly. Rollo stood up when I came in. That surprised me. He had the careful, deliberate movements of a man who was very aware that everything he did in this building was being observed and evaluated, but the standing felt genuine rather than calculated. An old reflex, the kind that comes from a certain kind of upbringing that persists even when everything else has gone sideways. "Mr. Harmon," he said. His voice was a Chicago voice, the flat vowels of the North Side, the particular cadence of a man who had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned early to say exactly what you meant without decoration. "I asked to speak with you because I thought you deserved to hear some of this directly. Not through reports. Not through lawyers." He paused. "I have a daughter. She is 31 years old, and she lives in Phoenix, and she has no idea what her father has been doing for the last 7 years. I thought about that a great deal last night." I sat down across from him. I did not say anything yet. 31 years of interviewing people had taught me that the most useful thing you can do in the first 2 minutes of a conversation is nothing. Give a person the space to say what they came to say, and they usually will. "I met Vivian Croft 7 years ago," Rollo said, settling back into his chair. "Through a mutual business contact, a real estate attorney who handled transactions for several of the same clients. She approached me about a consulting arrangement. She needed someone who understood how money moves, not the legal side, she had lawyers for that, but the practical side, the mechanics. He folded his hands on the table. They were the hands of a man who had spent his career behind a desk, oft, careful, ink-stained at the right index finger, in a way that suggested he still used a pen for things most people used computers for. The mechanics, I said. You move money in stages, Rallo said. That is the fundamental principle. You do not take dirty money and deposit it directly into a clean account. That is how amateurs get caught. You move it through intermediate structures. Companies that have legitimate-looking purposes, that generate paperwork, that pay invoices and receive payments and file tax returns, that look at a surface examination like the records of ordinary businesses. The money goes in at one end as a consulting fee or a licensing payment. It comes out the other end as a distribution to a member of the LLC. By the time it arrives, it has been documented at every step. The documentation is false, but it exists. He said this without effect, the way a man describes a technical process he has executed many times, not proud of it, not ashamed in the way that involves performance, just accurate. Vivian provided the structure, he said. The companies, the signatories, the paperwork. My role was the movement. I maintained relationships with the businesses that generated the incoming payments. I won't go into the details of those relationships because that is part of what I am prepared to discuss with the federal team, and I coordinated the timing of the transfers to avoid triggering the reporting thresholds. Under federal law, financial institutions are required to file a currency transaction report for any cash transaction exceeding $10,000 and a suspicious activity report when patterns suggest structuring the deliberate breaking up of transactions to stay below that threshold. Rallo's job, as he described it, had been to keep every individual transaction small enough and irregular enough that no single transfer would draw automated scrutiny, while the aggregate over 14 months reached $7.4 million. How many people have you done this for? I said. He looked at me steadily. Vivian is the only one I am prepared to discuss at this time. That's not an answer. No, he said. It isn't. He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table. Mr. Harm, I came in here because I want you to understand something. I knew the money was dirty. I knew the companies were shells. What I did not know, what I was specifically not told, which I now understand was a deliberate choice on Vivian's part, was that the signatory on those accounts was a young woman who had signed documents she didn't understand under circumstances that constituted fraud. I thought the signatory was a willing participant, a family member who understood the arrangement and had agreed to it. He stopped. Something moved across his face that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but occupied the territory between them. I saw her on the floor, he said. When I came in that night, I saw what had been done to her. His jaw tightened. I have a daughter. She is 31 years old. That is all I will say about that. I sat with that for a moment. The room was quiet except for the sound of the building's heating system and faintly the noise of the street below. You're cooperating, I said. Fully, he said. Everything. Names, dates, account numbers, the structure of every transaction I was involved in. The federal team has my attorney's contact information, and we are prepared to begin formal debriefing tomorrow morning. He looked at me directly with the eyes of a man who has made a decision and is not going back on it. I am not a good man, Mr. Harmon. I have not been a good man for a long time, but I am not the man who put your daughter on that floor. And I intend to make sure the person who has answers for it completely. I stood up. He stood up too again with that old reflex. One question, I said. Yes. The ring, I said. A white gold band with channel-set diamonds. It belonged to my daughter's mother. Vivian took it and pawned it. Do you know anything about that? He was quiet for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise but recognition. The look of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of the person he had been working for. I'll find out, he said. I'll make it part of the cooperation. I nodded once and walked to the... Behind me, I heard him exhale a long, slow breath, the sound of a man who has put down something very heavy and is only now beginning to feel how long he has been carrying it. The observation room, adjacent to interview 2, was a narrow space barely wide enough for 2 people to stand comfortably side by side with a one-way mirror, taking up most of the interior wall, and a speaker mounted near the ceiling that carried the audio from the room next door, with a slight electronic flatness that stripped warmth from voices and left only their essential qualities. Roy stood beside me. Neither of us spoke. Through the glass, Nathan Croft sat at the metal table with his right wrist in a soft brace. He had twisted it. During the struggle the previous night, nothing broken, the EMT report had confirmed, and his left hand wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that he had not touched since it was placed in front of him 20 minutes ago. He looked diminished. That is the accurate word. Not physically smaller, but reduced in some quality that I could not name, precisely the quality of a man who has spent years deriving his scale from proximity to someone else's authority and has now been separated from that authority and does not know how large he actually is on his own. Roy's detective, a woman named Gaines, sat across from Nathan with a legal pad and the unhurried patience of someone who had conducted enough of these conversations to know that the person across from her would fill the silence eventually. She had explained his rights to him. She had noted for the record that Nathan had declined the offer of counsel at this time and was choosing to speak voluntarily. She had given him the coffee. She waited. Nathan's attorney, the one Vivian had summoned the previous night, had arrived at the building that morning and been informed that his client had already invoked his right to proceed without counsel for this preliminary conversation. The attorney had expressed significant displeasure about this. Nathan had told him through the door in a voice that carried into the hallway that he needed to do this himself. That was the first thing that surprised me. She planned it before we met, Nathan said finally to the untouched coffee cup. His voice had the quality of someone speaking from a very long way inside himself, as if the words were making a significant journey to reach the surface. The whole thing. She had identified 3 other women before Cassie. 2 of them didn't work out. One had family, who asked too many questions. One had a brother who was a CPA and would have recognized what the documents were. Cassie was the 3rd candidate. Gaines wrote something on her pad. How do you know this? Because she told me, Nathan said. She told me after the wedding once Cassie had signed the first round of documents. She said... He stopped, pressed his lips together. She said she had been careful this time, that she had chosen well. The room next door was very quiet. In the observation room, Roy exhaled slowly through his nose. Did you know before the wedding? Gaines asked. A long pause. Nathan's left hand tightened on the paper cup, denting it slightly. I knew something was planned, he said. I didn't know the full scope. I told myself I didn't want to know the full scope. He looked up from the cup for the first time directly at the mirror, and for one disorienting moment it felt as though he was looking straight at me. That is not the same as not knowing. I understand that now. I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me and turned. Tommy was standing in the doorway of the observation room, still in the jacket. He had driven through the night, wearing his hair pushed back from his face in a way that meant he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. He was 6'2" and had his mother's eyes and the build of a man who spent his working life loading and unloading a 40-foot trailer, and he looked at Nathan through the glass with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier, but something quieter and more permanent than anger. Nathan had not turned around. He could not see the observation room, but something made him stop mid-sentence and go very still, the way animals go still when they sense a change in the environment they cannot yet identify. "Tommy," I said quietly, "he can't see you." "I know," Tommy said. He did not move. He kept looking through the glass. In the interview room, Gaines asked Nathan about his prior employment history. He answered haltingly, and then she asked about his departure from a financial consulting firm in 2018. The haltingness became something else, a specific, targeted reluctance. "That was a personnel matter," Nathan said. "We have the termination documentation," Gaines said pleasantly. "I'd like to hear your account." Tommy, standing beside me, said nothing. But his jaw tightened, and I understood in the way you understand things about people. You have known your whole life that what Gaines was about to uncover was something Tommy had known and carried and said nothing about for reasons that he would explain to me later in the hospital parking lot, quietly, with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face turned away. Nathan had been terminated from the 2018 position for falsifying expense records over a period of 11 months, reimbursement claims for client entertainment expenses that had never occurred, totaling slightly over $40,000. The firm had declined to press charges in exchange for full restitution and a signed non-disclosure agreement. Nathan had paid the restitution from a loan his mother provided. He had signed the NDA. He had never disclosed it to anyone he subsequently met, including Cassie. Under Federal Rules of Evidence Rule 404B, evidence of prior bad acts is inadmissible to prove a person's general character, but is admissible to prove intent, knowledge, or absence of mistake. Nathan's 2018 falsification, demonstrating that he had both the capacity and the willingness to construct false financial documentation, was directly relevant to the question of whether his participation in Vivian's scheme reflected conscious intent rather than unwitting compliance. Gaines noted this in her pad without visible reaction. Nathan was still talking, the words coming out faster now, with the particular acceleration of someone who has decided to unburden and has discovered that the unburdening once started has its own momentum. He talked about the documents he had signed at his mother's direction. He talked about the instructions he had given Cassie on which calls to answer and what to say. He talked about the social media account and the messages to Cassie's friends, which he had composed himself based on templates Vivian provided. He talked for 40 minutes. When he finally stopped, he looked at the surface of the table and said in a voice from which almost everything had been wrung, "I told myself I was protecting her, Cassie, that if she didn't know the details, she couldn't be in trouble." He paused. "I told myself that every day for 14 months. In the observation room, Tommy turned away from the glass. He walked to the far corner and stood there with his back to the mirror and his arms crossed over his chest and his head down. And I let him stand there, because that was what he needed. And because some things a person has to stand inside alone for a while before they can come back out." "Dale," he said finally to the wall. "Yeah," I said. "She's going to be okay," he said. "Right." I looked through the glass at Nathan Croft, reduced and talking, choosing now what he had not chosen when it mattered. Then I looked at my son, standing in the corner, with the weight of something he had known and not said, pressing down on his shoulders. "She's already okay," I said. "She got herself out. We just drove the car." Tommy turned around. His eyes were red at the edges. He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting something he needs to accept. And then he squared his shoulders, the way Harmon men square their shoulders, which is to say, without announcement, and walked back to stand beside me at the glass. They brought Vivian Croft into interview 2 at 2:17 in the afternoon, 14 hours and change after Roy's officers had separated her from the living room of her own house and put her in the back of a squad car, with her hands secured in front of her and her silver hair, for the first time in my experience of her, not perfectly in place. It was in place now. 14 hours in a holding facility, and Vivian Croft had managed to restore her hair to its customary order. I did not know how, and I did not ask. It seemed in a way I could not entirely explain important to note. She sat down at the table with the measured deliberateness of someone choosing very consciously how to occupy a chair. Not perching, not slumping, sitting with her back straight and her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her chin at the precise angle of a woman who has decided that this room, these circumstances, and these people do not have the power to diminish her unless she permits them to. Her attorney, a man named Whitfield, who had the expensive suit and careful affect of someone retained specifically for high-stakes situations, sat to her left. He had already filed 2 motions that morning. He would file 3 more before the week was out. He was doing his job, which was to make the prosecution's path as difficult as possible, and he was doing it well, and none of it was going to be enough. I knew that the moment I saw Vivian's face through the glass, because here is what I have learned in 31 years of watching people sit in rooms like that one. The people who are going to be saved by their lawyers look at their lawyers. The people who are not saved by their lawyers look straight ahead. Vivian looked straight ahead. Detective Gaines opened the session with procedural language identification of those present, confirmation that the session was being recorded, recitation of rights, that Whitfield interrupted twice to annotate on behalf of his client. Vivian sat through this with the patience of someone waiting for a bus she knows is coming. She had not looked at Gaines directly. She had not looked at the mirror. She was looking at a point on the wall approximately 8 inches above the door, with the fixed inward attention of a woman conducting a private calculation. Tommy had left the observation room 20 minutes earlier. I had told him to go to the hospital, that Cassie would want him there, that there was nothing more for him to do in this building today. He had gone without argument, which told me he was more wrung out than he was showing. Roy had stepped out to take a call. I was alone in the narrow room with the speaker and the glass. Gaines placed a tablet on the table and navigated to an audio file. She stated for the record the date, time, and origin of the recording. A voice memo file recovered from the personal phone of Dale Harmon, recorded on the evening of November 18th, and capturing audio from the interior of the Croft residence, beginning at approximately 1:11 in the morning. Whitfield objected immediately, citing chain of custody concerns. Gaines noted the objection for the record and explained with the unhurried precision of someone who had anticipated this objection and prepared for it, that the recording had been made by a participant in the conversation under Illinois statute, that it had been transferred directly from Mr. Harmon's device to the department's evidence server in the presence of 2 witnesses within 4 hours of the arrest, and that the chain of custody documentation was complete and available for review. Whitfield made a note. Vivian did not move. Gaines pressed play. The recording began with road noise, the sound of a car on a nighttime highway, the slight echo of a voice memo recorded in an enclosed space. Then footsteps on a front walk, gravel shifting. Then, unmistakably cutting through the November night, with absolute clarity, Vivian Croft's voice. Harder. Go harder. Just keep it off her face. She still needs to sign the papers in the morning. The quality of silence that followed those words in the interview room and in the observation room both was the kind of silence that has weight. You could feel it pressing. Vivian closed her eyes. It lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. 4 seconds with her eyes closed and her hands still folded on the table and her back still straight, and then she opened her eyes and she was looking at the same point on the wall above the door, and her face had returned to exactly the expression it had worn before the recording played, except that her hands, I noticed, were no longer folded. The fingers of her right hand were pressed flat against the table surface, and the pressure was enough that the tips had gone pale. Whitfield leaned toward her and said something quietly. She did not look at him. She said something back equally quiet, and he straightened and wrote something on his legal pad and underlined it. Gaines asked Vivian if she would like to respond to the recording. Vivian said, "I would like to speak to my son." Gaines said, "Nathan is currently providing a statement in a separate location." A pause, short 3 seconds at most. But in those 3 seconds, something happened in Vivian Croft's face that I had not seen there before, in all the months I had been watching her from the margins of her life. Not collapse, not grief. Something colder than either of those things, the specific expression of a person recalculating after the removal of a piece they had counted on being in place. She had not known Nathan was talking. She had sat in this room for 6 hours, assuming that her son, as he had always done, would hold the line. "I see," she said. 2 words, completely level. And then she looked for the first time directly at Detective Gaines, with the eyes of a woman who has just revised her entire strategy in real time and is already 3 moves into the new one. "I would like a brief recess to confer with my attorney," she said. Gaines said, "Of course." The recording stopped. Gaines closed the tablet. Whitfield began gathering his papers with the careful speed of a man who understood he had just been handed a significant amount of work. Vivian sat very still while he did this, her right hand still flat on the table, the fingertips still pale. She did not ask about Cassie. Not once in the 40 minutes she sat in that room did she say my daughter's name. I stood at the glass and looked at her, and I thought about the woman who had raised a glass at a wedding reception and smiled at me across a tent full of flowers. And I thought about the woman who had taken a ring out of a wooden box while my daughter was in the next room. And I thought about the woman who had stood over her daughter-in-law in a darkened living room and given an order she had clearly given before. I thought there are people in the world who are the way they are, completely all the way down, without interruption. And then I put on my jacket, and I walked out of that narrow room, and I went to find my son and my daughter. The federal courthouse on South Dearborn Street is a building designed to communicate permanence. The ceilings are high. The marble floors carry sound in a way that makes every footstep consequential. The wooden benches in the gallery have the particular hardness of furniture that was never intended for comfort, only for endurance. The message being that what happens in this room matters enough to be uncomfortable for, and you will sit with that discomfort and not fidget. I had testified in federal courtrooms before. I had sat in the gallery of this specific building twice in my career watching cases I had worked reach their conclusions. I had never sat in one with my daughter on my left and my son on my right, and my sister behind me with her hand resting on my shoulder. And I had never understood, until that December morning, how different those 2 experiences are. The professional distance of a man watching justice operate on someone else's life, and the complete absence of distance when the life in question is your own. The trial itself had taken 11 weeks. I will not walk you through all of it, the procedural motions, the evidentiary hearings, the cross-examinations that stretched across multiple sessions, and that Whitfield conducted with the tenacious precision of a man earning every dollar of his considerable fee. What I will tell you is that Carol Brandt was better. Not louder, not more aggressive better. She had the documents, she had the recordings, she had Cassie's testimony delivered over 2 days in a voice that did not waver once, with a clarity and specificity that I recognized as the same quality Cassie had brought to everything since she was 9 years old, turning puzzle pieces over in her careful hands until she understood exactly how they fit. She had Rallo's cooperation, which had produced account records, transaction logs, and the identities of 3 additional individuals connected to the scheme whose prosecutions were proceeding separately. She had Pastor Wade, who testified about Nathan's pre-wedding threat, with his hands folded on the railing and his voice steady in the way voices get when a person has finally said the true thing out loud and discovered it does not destroy them. She had Brenda Cole's 4 years of dated, timed, precise observations, which the prosecution introduced as pattern of behavior evidence under Federal Rule 404B, and which the jury had clearly found compelling based on the way they looked at Vivian during those particular hours of testimony. What she had above all else was the recording. 47 seconds of audio that the prosecution played 3 times during the trial, once during opening arguments, once during Carol's direct examination of Dale as a witness, and once during closing arguments in the silence of a courtroom, where even Whitfield had stopped writing. 47 seconds in which Vivian Croft's voice, clear and unhurried, and entirely without remorse, gave an order that no amount of subsequent legal strategy could reframe as anything other than what it was. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days. I spent most of that time in the hallway outside the courtroom, with Tommy, the 2 of us working through 3 rounds of bad vending machine coffee and saying very little, which was the appropriate amount to say. Gloria stayed with Cassie in the gallery, the 2 of them occupying the same bench where they had sat every day of the 11-week trial, Gloria knitting the same pale blue project she had been working on since the hospital, Cassie reading both of them, performing the ordinary activities of people who have decided that waiting is something you do with your hands occupied. The foreperson was a woman in her 60s, a retired school principal from Hyde Park, who read the verdict with the measured cadence of someone who understood the weight of what she was saying and was not going to rush it. On the charge of wire fraud in violation of 18 United States Code Section 1343, guilty. On the charge of money laundering in violation of 18 United States Code Section 1956, guilty. On the charge of aggravated identity theft in violation of 18 United States Code Section 1028A, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit the above offenses, guilty. I watched Cassie's face as each count was read. She did not cry. She sat very straight the way Harmon people sit when they are holding something significant, and she looked at the foreperson with the full attention of someone receiving information she has been waiting for. When the last count was read, she exhaled a long, slow breath, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, and then she reached over and found my hand, without looking at it, and held on. Tommy on my other side put his arm around my shoulders. Behind me, Gloria made a sound that was not quite a word. The sentencing hearing came 3 weeks later. The federal judge, a woman of 68 who had presided over the trial with an even-handedness that I had come to deeply respect, reviewed the presentencing report and the victim impact statements. Cassie's submitted in writing. The statements of 2 women. Brenda Cole's records had helped investigators identify, and a statement from the director of a nonprofit organization that had been defrauded of grant funds routed through Vivian's network. She sentenced Vivian Croft to 22 years in federal prison. She sentenced Nathan Croft to 9 years with credit for cooperation, noting for the record that his assistance to the prosecution had been substantive and consistent, but that it did not alter the fundamental nature of his participation in the harm caused. The forfeiture order entered simultaneously transferred the Croft estate in Winnetka and all associated assets to the federal government for liquidation, with proceeds directed to the restitution fund for identified victims. The estate that Vivian had spent decades constructing as both fortress and instrument would be cataloged, appraised, and sold at auction. Whatever she had built there was finished. Carol Brandt found me in the hallway afterward. She shook my hand and said, "Your daughter is one of the most composed witnesses I have ever put on a stand. You should tell her that." "She knows," I said, "but I'll tell her anyway." Outside on South Dearborn. The December air was cold and carrying the first suggestion of snow. Cassie looped her arm through mine, and we stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. The four of us, me, Cassie, Tommy, Gloria, not going anywhere yet, just standing in the cold and the pale winter light together, which was enough. I had been right. Standing on those steps, I felt something I did not have a precise name for, not triumph, not relief exactly, but something solid and quiet, the feeling of a thing completed, of a weight, set down in the right place after being carried a very long way. Tommy said, "Who's hungry?" Gloria said, "I have been hungry since 9 this morning." Cassie laughed, and we went to find somewhere warm. March came in cold that year, the way it sometimes does in northern Illinois, bright and clear and deceptively cheerful, the kind of morning that looks like spring from behind a window and reminds you immediately upon stepping outside that it is not. The maple tree in my front yard, the one Lena had planted the spring after Tommy was born, had put out its first small buds, pale red against the gray morning sky, tentative and committed at the same time. Cassie came through the front door at 11 in the morning with a duffel bag over one shoulder, and Gloria behind her carrying a casserole dish that smelled of chicken and thyme. Tommy had driven up from Indianapolis the night before and was already in the kitchen, having arrived at 6 in the morning and spent the intervening hours rearranging my refrigerator in a way that he considered more efficient and that I would silently undo over the following week. She stopped in the entryway and looked at the house. Not at anything specific at the house itself, the way you look at a place you have been away from for longer than you intended. The coat rack with the same jackets in the same order. The watercolor of the Lake Michigan shoreline above the radiator that Lena had bought at a street fair in Evanston, the summer Cassie was 4. The particular quality of morning light through the east-facing windows that fills the entryway in a way that has always seemed to me like an argument for this specific house over any other. She exhaled slowly, the same long breath she had released in the courtroom when the last verdict was read, but different in quality. That one had been relief. This one was recognition. The ease of a person arriving somewhere their body has always known was home. "It smells the same," she said. "I use the same soap," I said. She shook her head at me, fond exasperation, completely genuine, and then crossed the entryway and hugged me the way she used to when she was small, both arms face against my shoulder, her whole self committed to it. I held on. I was not going to be the one to let go first. Gloria moved around us into the kitchen with the practical efficiency of a woman who expresses love through the preparation and transportation of food. Tommy appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation, and silently retreated. We ate lunch at the kitchen table, the four of us, with Gloria's chicken and a loaf of bread from the bakery on Peterson that Lena had always liked. Tommy argued at length for a stretch of highway in New Mexico as home to the best roadside green chile in the country. Gloria described a patient's unsolicited critique of the hospital parking garage with the professional equanimity of someone who has learned to receive many things that way. I mentioned the raccoon who had been visiting my backyard at 3 in the morning for 2 weeks, whom I had named Gerald. Cassie laughed. It was different from the laugh in the hospital that one had escaped before she could plan it, surprised and unlocked. This laugh knew it was allowed to be there. It started in her eyes first, working its way down before it made any sound, exactly the way Lena's laugh had always started. After lunch, Gloria washed and Tommy dried, and I sat with my coffee while Cassie took the chair across from me, the chair where she had done homework for 12 consecutive years. And we talked the way people talk when they have stopped managing a crisis and remembered how to simply be in a room together. She had found a therapist. She liked a woman in Lincoln Square who had a specific practice around recovery from coercive relationships, and who, according to Cassie, said true things without making them sound like verdicts. Brianna Walsh had cried on the phone for 10 minutes and then announced she was coming over with takeout that weekend, which was not a question. Cassie had started running again in the mornings, short distances, just enough to feel her body choosing to do something. She was thinking about going back to work in the spring, not to her old firm. Something different, direction known, destination still open. That struck me as exactly the right place to be. Outside, the maple moved in the March wind, its first buds catching the afternoon light. "Daddy," she said, turning her coffee cup in both hands. "Can I ask you something?" "Always," I said. "That night, when you found the note and got in the car, did you think about not going?" I looked at her across the table, serious-faced from birth, turning the question over the way she had always turned things, wanting the true answer. "No," I said. "Were you scared?" "Yes. Every mile of the drive." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "But you came anyway." "Cassie," I set my cup down. "There is no version of that night where I don't come. No distance, no locked door, no situation on earth that changes that." I paused. "You know that." "I know," she said. "I just wanted to hear you say it." From the kitchen, Tommy and Gloria were disagreeing pleasantly about the correct method for storing leftover casserole, a dispute that had existed in various forms since approximately 1987. Cassie listened to them, and something shifted in her expression that I had not seen on her face in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Happiness is too simple. More like the return of something she had put down somewhere and had not been sure she would find again. She stood up, put her hand on my shoulder for a moment, brief warm there and gone, and went upstairs. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, unhurried and familiar, moving through this house the way she had always moved through it. I sat with my coffee and listened to my children argue about casserole. And I thought about Lena, and I thought about Gerald, and I thought about a rainy Sunday in March of 2002, when a 9-year-old girl with a red pen and a yellow legal pad built something careful and lasting between us, without either of us knowing yet how much we would one day need it. Then I stood up, walked to my desk, and opened the top drawer. The pen was in the back of the top drawer behind a box of paper clips and a spare set of house keys and a tube of hand cream that had been there since Lena put it there and that I had never moved. It was a small pen, the retractable kind, blue ink, the clip bent slightly from being carried in a pocket. I had found it on Cassie's shoe insert, the morning after the arrest, when the EMTs had left her sneakers by the hospital bed, and I had picked them up to set them aside and felt the slight unevenness under the padding, and looked. I had put it in the drawer that same morning. I had not known yet what I was going to do with it. I knew now. Cassie was in her room. I could hear her moving around up there, the familiar creak of the third floorboard from the window, the sound of a drawer opening and closing, the sounds of a person unpacking, settling, taking up space again in a place that had always held a space for her. I went to the bottom of the stairs. "Cassie," I called up. A pause. Then, "Yeah. Come down when you have a minute." She appeared at the top of the stairs 30 seconds later in her socks and an old sweatshirt from a 5K she had run 8 years ago, her hair loose, and she looked so ordinary and so herself that something in my chest loosened in a way I had not felt in a very long time. She came down and followed me to the living room, and we sat on the couch, the same couch that had been in this room since before she was born, and I held out the pen. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. "You kept it," she said. "Of course I kept it," I said. She took it from my hand carefully, the way you take something small and significant, and turned it over in her fingers. The bent clip. The worn tip. 21 years old at least since the rainy Sunday we had built the code. Though this particular pen had been bought more recently and pressed into service for the most important message it would ever carry. 45 seconds, she said quietly to the pen. 45 seconds, I said. She closed her fingers around it and held it in her fist for a moment, and I watched her face move through something private and complete, the way faces do when a person is finishing a conversation they have been having with themselves for a long time. Then she looked up at me and her eyes were bright, and she said, "Thank you for coming, Daddy." I stopped. Started again because some things deserve to be said plainly without decoration. Just send the signal. I will always come. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder the way she had when she was small, and I put my arm around her, and we sat in the living room of the house where she had grown up, while the March evening settled around us, and the maple tree outside the window held its first red buds against the darkening sky. After a while she said, "Gerald better not get into the yard again tonight." "He will," I said. "He always does." She laughed and we stayed right where we were. Looking back on everything that happened, I think about the years I spent telling myself that silence was the same as safety. That if I didn't push, didn't question, didn't look too closely at what was right in front of me, somehow everything would work itself out. It didn't. It never does. Don't be like me. If something feels wrong about the person your child loves, say it out loud. Say it more than once. Gloria said it, and I waved her off, and my daughter paid the price for my willingness to choose hope over honesty. That is a weight I will carry for the rest of my life, and I carry it so you don't have to. I believe God puts certain instincts in a father's chest for a reason. The night I read that message, I didn't hesitate, not because I was brave, but because something deeper than bravery moved my feet to the door. Trust that voice. In every grandpa story worth telling, in every family story worth passing down, the moment that matters is not the crisis itself, it's the choice you make before you fully understand what you're walking into. These grandpa stories, these family stories, they are not just entertainment. They are reminders. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below and tell me what it meant. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't yet subscribed, there are more stories coming that I think you'll want to stay for. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. One final note, some stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted with the sole purpose of exploring the human experience and the lessons it offers. If that's not for you, that's completely okay. Step away and find what serves you better. But if you're still here, I'm glad you are.